There are few sounds more deafening than a military jet forced to abort landing at the last second, especially when it barrels low over a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sonic boom shattered lawn gnomes, set off every car alarm on the block, and sent HOA President Karen Witherspoon diving under her patio table, clutching her chihuahua like the sky was falling. To be fair, in her mind, it was. Moments earlier, she'd proudly parked her brand-new luxury SUV across the center of what she declared to be a community walking path, blissfully unaware that the strip of tarmac she'd blocked wasn't just a private runway, it was a federally approved military airlift zone. I watched the chaos unfold from my hangar's catwalk, iced coffee in hand, as the pilot's voice crackled through my emergency radio. Runway obstructed. Abort. Repeat, abort. Tell your HOA princess to move her chariot. That's how it all started. Not with a knock or a notice, but with a roar from the sky and a woman who thought she ruled the land, right up until she tried to conquer the air. My name's Mark Callahan, though folks in my former life knew me better by my call sign, Rook. 20 years of coordinating Black Ops logistics for the United States Air Force taught me many things, but nothing could have prepared me for the war zone that is suburban HOA politics. After retiring, I settled on a stretch of land inherited from my grandfather, a retired bush pilot who'd built a private runway back in the day for medical supply drops and emergency missions. I upgraded it. Lights, reinforced tarmac, smart systems, so it could support confidential military cargo runs when needed. It wasn't flashy, and I kept it quiet on purpose. Most of the town barely knew it existed, and I liked it that way. That all changed when the HOA redistricted 3 rural zones into their sprawl-loving neighborhood master plan, citing land integration for safety and aesthetics. The land wasn't for sale, but through some bylaw manipulation and zoning magic, the committee managed to rope in part of my property's perimeter. That wouldn't have meant much, except they decided it gave them say over the entire space, including the runway. Enter Karen Witherspoon, 49, newly elected HOA president, and hellbent on proving she could outregulate a flight controller. Within a week, she sent me a typed letter with 15 violations, including unauthorized usage of asphalt, unregistered vehicle operations, and, my favorite, airborne disturbances inconsistent with community values. I figured it was just bark with no teeth. Until the gate showed up. It was a Sunday morning. I was running pre-checks for a scheduled military supply drop, a low-visibility mission transporting encrypted communications gear to a secure facility 60 miles north. Weather was clear, all systems green. Then I spotted it. Right in the middle of the airstrip, about 300 feet in, stood a metal gate, freshly installed with concrete anchors, a keypad, and a bright red sign. No access. HOA property. I thought it had to be a prank. But no. Standing proudly beside it, arms crossed like she was guarding Buckingham Palace, was Karen. She wore her classic pastel visor, a clipboard strapped to her hip, and an expression that said she'd waited all week for this moment. I tried the diplomatic route, walked up calmly, explained in full detail, without revealing classified info, that this airstrip was more than just my hobby. I told her the incoming aircraft wasn't mine, that it belonged to a logistics team working under government contract. I even offered to show her the non-disclosure I'd signed with Federal Logistics Command, hoping she'd at least realize she was out of her depth. Instead, she tapped her pen against her clipboard and said, "Mr. Callahan, this isn't the Mojave. We have rules here. If you want to run a circus, do it on land not zoned for tranquility." Before I could respond, my secure radio buzzed. The plane was already inbound, ETA 6 minutes. They couldn't reach altitude fast enough to reroute. I radioed back that the strip was compromised. Then, the jet screamed overhead, missed the runway by 20 feet, and punched through the clouds like a bullet. The Chihuahua screamed louder than the engine. Karen dropped her clipboard and yelled something about national harassment. I stood there, stunned. She'd just blocked a military operation with a fence and a frown. What followed was a perfect storm of paperwork and rage. The military brass wasn't pleased. They had to divert their cargo and redo the entire delivery. I got a not-so-gentle call from Colonel Green, asking if I had lost control of my perimeter. I tried to explain the HOA situation, but his silence spoke volumes. He said, "We don't negotiate with suburban terrorists, Mark. Handle it." And then he hung up. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down. She began patrolling the airstrip with her dog, acting like she was defending sacred HOA soil. She took pictures of every light fixture, every parked utility cart, every fuel tank, and even accused my technician, Marcus, of aerial loitering for flying a drone to inspect the landing lights. When I confronted her again, she insisted she'd filed a zoning appeal to reclaim the strip as recreational green space. I laughed. She didn't. A week passed. Tensions skyrocketed. HOA newsletters began including my airstrip in their Neighborhood Safety Concerns section. Karen even staged a community gathering on the runway. Lawn chairs, citronella candles, music, the works. Her reason? Raising awareness about flight pollution. I tried contacting city officials, but they danced around jurisdiction. The land technically still belonged to me, but the airspace and operational access were now under review due to Karen's claims. Apparently, she'd pulled strings with a cousin in zoning administration. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be solved with logic. Karen had turned my runway into her battleground, and now innocent people, pilots, technicians, even neighbors, were caught in the fallout. I recorded everything. Every incident. Every noise complaint she filed against non-existent aircraft. Every time she moved the "No trespassing" signs closer to my hangar. Then one night, I caught her and 2 HOA volunteers, people who should have known better, dragging sandbags onto the airstrip to keep it from being used until the appeal was processed. I called the sheriff. They said it was a civil matter. I called the FAA. They said it wasn't their concern without an incident. Well, we already had one, and if she wasn't stopped soon, the next aborted landing might not miss. That night, I sat alone in the hangar, staring at a runway I'd built to help people, now overrun by someone who had no idea what she was interfering with. I pulled out a sealed envelope marked, "Use only if civility fails." It was from Green. Inside was a direct contact to the base's public security liaison and a classified clearance override. I hadn't wanted to pull rank. I hadn't wanted to cause a scene. But Karen left me no choice. She thought she was blocking planes. What she didn't realize was she was about to be hit by a force that operated far above HOA jurisdiction. And unlike her, we didn't bluff. We deployed. I stood up, dialed the number, and said the words that would change everything. "It's time. Tell command the runway's compromised. Send in the team." By the time the sun rose the next morning, the airstrip looked like the set of a bizarre HOA civil protest. Karen had surrounded the gate she installed with plastic orange cones, a makeshift banner that read "Keep Our Neighborhood Safe," and a stack of lawn chairs arranged in a semicircle. A few of her faithful supporters sat sipping coffee like it was a peaceful demonstration rather than an obstruction of a federal operation. One of them, a retired dentist named Earl, was passing out pamphlets titled "Danger in the Skies: Why Private Runways Don't Belong in Peaceful Communities." The irony of them blocking a runway designed for emergency and national security use was entirely lost on them. I didn't confront them. I didn't even look their way. I had already activated the quiet parts of my background that Karen and her committee had no clue about. And while I wasn't about to disclose classified information, I knew that ignoring Karen had its limit. What I needed now was evidence, not just of her actions, but of her intent. That's when the idea struck me. I'd let Karen talk herself into a corner on camera. I installed a small series of solar-powered security cams along the perimeter. Nothing dramatic, nothing hidden. All perfectly legal under state law, especially given that it was my property. Within 2 days, I had hours of footage. Karen walking the strip with a tape measure, claiming she was mapping the blast radius. Karen telling a neighbor that I was probably harboring illegal drones. Karen even instructing a teenage HOA volunteer to pour gravel along the landing zone to keep the big toys from landing. It was ridiculous. It was petty. But it was also enough. While the cameras rolled, I prepared a packet, a detailed binder that included zoning maps, property lines, FAA airfield approval documents, and my DoD contractor license, along with the video stills. I didn't send it to Karen. I didn't send it to the city. I sent it to the HOA board, 6 members who, up until now, had let Karen steamroll over procedure like a bulldozer in pearls. I requested 10 minutes to speak at the next HOA town hall. The request was reluctantly approved, and I knew exactly how to use those 10 minutes. When I arrived at the community center on Thursday evening, the parking lot was overflowing. Word had spread that I would be speaking, and Karen had mobilized her followers. The inside looked more like a political rally than a neighborhood discussion. She had prepped a projector, printed flyers, and even brought a laser pointer. I watched as she opened with a dramatic slideshow showing zoomed-in images of aircraft wheels, runway cracks, and one particularly blurry image of me refueling. She claimed it was proof of illegal jet fuel handling, which got a few concerned murmurs from the audience. When it was my turn, I calmly walked to the front with my binder, flipped to the first page, and said, "That blurry photo is a military-certified aviation fuel container. The man in the photo is me. The location is a federally approved logistics route." Then I pressed play on a short video clip of Karen saying to her assistant, "I don't care who he works for, this is HOA Turf N." There was an audible shift in the room. The murmurs turned into gasps, and for the first time, Karen looked genuinely uneasy. I flipped through images of her spray painting over the runway's directional lines, her dragging a trash bin across the tarmac, her encouraging kids to play hopscotch with chalk in the touchdown zone. I ended with a satellite map clearly marking the boundaries between my property and the community perimeter. "Everything you've seen her do," I concluded, "is on land she does not own, govern, or have any legal claim to. And she has blocked a federal air logistics route 3 times in 10 days. If the next emergency supply drop fails because of her gate, there won't be a town hall meeting. There will be a congressional hearing." Then I sat down. Karen tried to recover. She waved her arms, accused me of fabricating the footage, and even said, "I think he's trying to intimidate us with military threats." But her words fell flat. The room had turned. The HOA board called an emergency recess, and Karen stormed out, visibly shaking. That evening, the board announced they would review all gate-related activities and suspended any further aesthetic modifications until the legal team could review the situation. That was the first crack in her armor. But I knew she wasn't done. The next morning, Karen retaliated in the most Karen way imaginable. She called the city zoning office and filed a formal complaint alleging I was operating an unlicensed airport in a residential zone. She claimed the airstrip posed noise hazards, toxic fuel risks, and, most absurd of all, that it attracted dangerous aircraft not suited for community life. She submitted sound-level graphs and traffic flow diagrams she'd printed from the internet, with absolutely no relation to my runway. When I received notice of the complaint, I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I called my contact at the Department of Defense, Colonel Green. He was less amused. "We've already had to reroute 2 supply runs," he said. "One of those was carrying life-saving equipment. We're running out of patience." I told him about Karen's latest legal stunt. There was a long pause before he said, "If she files another complaint, the gloves are off. You'll have full clearance to escalate. That means our legal team gets involved. No more HOA meetings. We go straight to state-level enforcement." Knowing that, I decided to visit city zoning myself. I brought every piece of documentation, including the latest footage of Karen tampering with runway lights. The zoning officer looked exhausted as I laid out the case. Honestly, he said, we've had 36 calls from that woman in the past year. Most of them about birdhouses. I left him with the binder and a request for a written determination. Within 48 hours, I had a formal response. My airstrip was in full compliance. Karen's complaint had been reviewed and rejected. But instead of celebrating, I braced myself. Because people like Karen don't retreat when they lose, they reload. Sure enough, the next weekend, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of metal grinding against concrete. I rushed outside and found a tow truck reversing into the runway, dragging a massive decorative boulder across the taxi path. Karen stood nearby, directing traffic like she was filming her own HOA reality show. I didn't yell. I didn't approach. I simply raised my phone and filmed everything. Then I called Colonel Green and said, "She just obstructed the strip again. Want me to send the video?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes. And this time, we're responding in person." What Karen didn't know was that the next flight scheduled to land wasn't just any aircraft. It was a high-security test flight tied to a federal security contract. And the military wasn't going to take kindly to another blocked landing. I didn't need to fight anymore. The storm I had been trying to avoid was now inevitable. Karen had declared war on a ghost runway. What she didn't realize was that it was connected to an army that didn't play by HOA rules. Her crusade had just earned her a front-row seat to consequences she'd never dreamed possible. And she wouldn't see them coming until the rotor blades shadowed her perfectly trimmed lawn. The day began with eerie calm, the kind that usually settles before a storm, and I knew exactly what kind of storm was brewing. I spent the morning inspecting the damage from the previous day. Karen's decorative boulder sat squarely across the taxi path, flanked by 2 more cones she'd personally labeled permanent community art. The HOA newsletter, which arrived like some absurd declaration of war, featured a full-page spread of Karen standing in front of the airstrip with the caption, "Taking back our neighborhood, one violation at a time." She really believed she'd won. But while she posed for photos and mailed out glossy propaganda, I was finalizing coordination with Colonel Green, who'd had enough of the Karen situation, as he now referred to it. I didn't need to plead anymore. The footage spoke for itself. And so did the national security delay logs, which now had 3 separate entries citing civilian obstruction. Late that afternoon, a recon drone hovered silently over the airfield. I didn't even pilot it. This one was dispatched directly by Green's team. It captured ultra-clear, high-res video of the blockage, including the SUV Karen had parked near the strip like some Royal Guard post. She'd even set up an umbrella stand and a lawn chair on the gravel shoulder. To the untrained eye, it looked like a weird tailgate party. To federal analysts, it looked like a civilian blockade of a federal utility. It took less than an hour for Green to send back confirmation. They were preparing to mobilize a ground inspection crew. I didn't warn Karen. I didn't give her a heads-up or a final chance to back off. She'd had every opportunity to de-escalate. But instead, she had chosen to escalate beyond reason. That night, the stars were unusually clear. I sat on the roof of my hangar, watching the blinking lights on the distant hills, military signals I knew well. Somewhere out there, a unit was prepping to intervene not with weapons or threats, but with jurisdiction and cold, methodical enforcement. And when they arrived, no HOA clause, gate, or banner was going to matter. The next morning began with an unexpected lull. Karen was nowhere to be seen, which was unusual. Typically, she strutted around by 7 a.m., clipboard in hand, documenting whatever leaves dared to fall out of place. But today, her lawn was empty. Her SUV was gone. For a brief second, I wondered if she'd caught wind of what was coming and decided to vanish before it hit. But no, she was simply running late. Around 9:15, she returned in full regalia, visor, sunglasses, and an aggressively yellow tracksuit, and strutted back to her lawn chair. She had no idea that, just an hour later, she would find herself at the center of something far beyond her control. At precisely 10:27 a.m., the sound of dual rotor blades echoed across the valley. Karen looked up, confused, shielding her eyes from the sun. Within seconds, a dark gray Chinook helicopter appeared on the horizon, descending rapidly toward the strip. Behind it, two military Humvees rumbled up the dirt access path, vehicles that absolutely did not belong in a gated suburb. Panic began spreading through the neighborhood like a fast-moving virus. Curtains twitched, kids pointed, phones were raised, and Karen, well, she did what only Karen could do in such a moment. She ran onto the airstrip waving her arms, yelling, "Unauthorized aircraft! Unauthorized vehicles! You are in violation of Neighborhood Code 17. The Chinook touched down in a swirl of dust, precisely aligned with the intact portion of the runway. Soldiers disembarked with precision, ignoring Karen entirely as they moved toward the boulder blockade. One of them raised a clipboard, an actual one, not the flimsy HOA kind, and barked instructions. Another pulled out a portable signal jammer, instantly knocking out Karen's phone livestream attempt. Her voice cracked with rage. "You can't do this. This is a peaceful zone. I've filed complaints. I'm a property president." I stood on the edge of the hangar, arms crossed, watching as two soldiers equipped with cutting tools and a mini crane began removing the boulder from the taxi path. They didn't speak to her. They didn't argue. They didn't care about bylaws or meetings. They were following orders, and those orders came from far above her pay grade. Karen, desperate for attention, ran toward the lead soldier and shouted, "Do you know who I am?" He looked at her for half a second and replied, "Yes, ma'am. You're on the obstruction report. Step aside." What followed as pure cinematic satisfaction. The entire blockade was dismantled in under 10 minutes. The cones were removed. The metal gate Karen had installed earlier was sliced off with a compact rotary saw. Every trace of her decorative art installation was packed into one of the Humvees. The Chinook lifted back off the ground, trailing a massive banner-sized warning that read, "Federal Operations Zone, do not obstruct." Karen stood frozen in place, dust settling around her, mouth open in stunned silence. But the show wasn't over. An unmarked black SUV rolled up the street, escorted by a second military vehicle. A man in a suit stepped out, briefcase in hand, aviators on his face. I knew who he was before he spoke. A Pentagon liaison, likely sent to deliver the final blow. He approached Karen and handed her an envelope. "Official notice," he said calmly. "Interference with federal logistics is a Class E felony under Title 18, Section 1361. You've been documented on video. The Department of Justice will be in touch." Karen's hand trembled as she took the envelope. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Then, for the first time since she'd launched her crusade, she turned and walked away without a single word. The neighborhood was stunned. People gathered in driveways whispering, pointing at the receding convoy. I could hear snippets, some shocked, some amused. "Did you see that helicopter? They just removed her gate like it was nothing. She got served by the Pentagon." Meanwhile, I returned to my hangar and checked my radio. Colonel Green's voice came through, calm and dry as ever. "Runway's clear. Operation Karen disengage successful. Nice footage, by the way." I smiled. "Appreciate the assist." He added, "Expect minimal interference moving forward. But let us know if she tries anything else. We've got a full FI now." Karen didn't show up for the rest of the day. Her SUV disappeared again. Rumor had it she was consulting an attorney, but it was too late for that. The footage, the complaints, the obstruction, all documented. She was no longer a thorn in the side of a neighbor. She was a federal liability under investigation. And as much as she might try to spin it as persecution, no HOA clause could protect her from what came next. Later that night, I took a walk down the now clear runway. The lights blinked steadily, the asphalt gleamed under the moonlight, and for the first time in weeks, Everything was exactly as it should be. No cones. No barriers. No boulders or banners. Just quiet, purposeful space ready to serve its mission again. And though I knew this wasn't the end, people like Karen rarely vanish without a dramatic exit, I also knew that something had changed. The air had shifted. And the runway was mine again, not just in ownership, but in principle. I reached the midpoint where her gate had once stood, and I knelt to brush away a few leftover bolts in the dirt. They clinked against each other, useless now, artifacts of a campaign built on arrogance and delusion. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I felt clarity. Some wars are fought with missiles. Some with mandates. But the most absurd, exhausting ones? They're fought with clipboards and cones. And sometimes the only way to win is to let the rotor blades do the talking. The neighborhood had barely begun to recover from the spectacle when the real consequences started rolling in. For a few brief hours, it almost seemed peaceful. The sky was clear, the runway unobstructed, and not a single HOA notice had appeared on my hangar door. But the silence didn't mean surrender. Karen might have been stunned into retreat, but retreat wasn't the same as defeat. She was licking her wounds, plotting in shadows, probably blaming everyone but herself for what had unfolded on that strip of tarmac. And sure enough, by the end of the week, the quiet shattered with the fury only a desperate HOA president could muster. It began with a new round of flyers slipped into every mailbox in the neighborhood. The paper was glossy, the fonts oversized and dramatic. Across the top, in red capital letters, it read, "Urgent Safety Alert." Below that was a heavily edited photo of the Chinook landing, darkened, filtered, and framed to make it look like a war zone had erupted in the middle of suburbia. The headline beneath said, "Government Forces Invade Private Neighborhood." I blinked twice to make sure I wasn't reading satire. Karen had gone full conspiracy theory, and she was trying to drag the neighborhood into her spiral. She followed the flyers with a community-wide emergency HOA meeting. Somehow, she twisted the events of the previous week into an attack on civil liberties and local governance. She claimed the military had overstepped. She ranted about shadow operations and secret air deals, and even implied that I was harboring surveillance equipment designed to spy on families. The fact that her statements made zero legal or logical sense didn't seem to bother her at all. She was no longer just overstepping her role, she was rewriting reality. But this time, fewer people were buying it. I didn't attend the meeting. I didn't need to. I had allies now. Not military ones. Those had done their job, but neighbors. People who'd once shrugged me off as the quiet guy with the weird hangar were now coming forward with stories. Stories about Karen shutting down lemonade stands, demanding homeowners repaint flower boxes, even filing noise complaints about kids playing catch. The military incident had broken the spell. Her obsession with control had finally shown its true cost, and now, the community was starting to turn. What Karen hadn't expected was for the HOA board to start asking questions. Real ones. The vice president, a mild-mannered retired Navy man named Dennis, had quietly begun reviewing every complaint Karen had filed in the last 6 months. The stack was enormous, but also repetitive and, more importantly, illegal in parts. She'd issued fines without approval, signed off on gate installations without a full vote, diverted funds from HOA reserves to pay for unnecessary signage and so-called community beautification projects, many of which were essentially just obstacles on my runway. And when the board confronted her about it in a closed session, she lost her composure. From what Dennis later told me, she accused them of betrayal, of undermining her leadership in a time of active invasion. She claimed I had weaponized the military against her and demanded full immunity from disciplinary action. When she didn't get it, she walked out. But instead of retreating into shame, she did what only Karen could do. She tried to fight fire with a flamethrower. She hired a lawyer. A week later, I was served with a notice of civil suit, Karen versus Callahan. The charges? Public endangerment, reckless aircraft operation, property devaluation, and mental anguish. The papers were laughable, filled with exaggerated accounts and accusations that bordered on delusion. She claimed my runway had created unlivable conditions, cited vibrations causing structural hairline fractures in her ceiling, and even accused me of airborne intimidation tactics. I knew this wasn't about winning. It was about retaliation. She couldn't beat me through the HOA, so now she wanted to bury me in legal hell. I handed the documents to my attorney, an old Air Force JAG friend named Lena, who read them twice before setting them on fire in a metal trash bin outside the hangar. She looked at me and said, "We're going to counter with everything. And when we're done, she's going to wish she'd just stuck to gardening complaints." I nodded. I wasn't scared. I was annoyed. The fight had gone from absurd to vindictive, and it wasn't just wasting my time. It was beginning to risk federal interference again. That same day, Colonel Green reached out. Not through official channels, just a courtesy call. He'd heard about the civil suit and was concerned. Apparently, the Pentagon legal team had already prepared a brief to intervene if necessary. They weren't going to let a logistics contractor be dragged through the mud for fulfilling duties under federal contract. Green warned me, though, to expect the next scheduled airlift soon, and that it would be a high-profile drop requiring both runway access and vehicle loading at the site. "This isn't just boxes and crates this time," he said. "You're hosting a briefing team from the National Security Communications Division. They land Tuesday. That gave me 4 days. I spent those 4 days preparing, not just the runway but the neighborhood. I went door to door, explaining the upcoming activity in calm, precise terms. I showed them the clearance documents and even offered printed copies of the FAA notices. Most neighbors were supportive now. A few even offered to move their cars further down the street to minimize noise or obstruction. Karen, however, had not gone silent. She ramped up her narrative. Her social media page became a frenzy of posts about government overreach, private property rights, and her battle against Black Ops tyranny. She posted blurry zoom-ins of the hangar, claimed she heard buzzing at night, and suggested it was some kind of spy drone I was using to monitor her. At this point, it was like watching someone drown in a pool of their own delusions. On Tuesday morning, right as scheduled, the aircraft came. 2 blacked-out helicopters and a C-130 cargo plane dropped in over the treeline like clockwork. Personnel poured out quickly and efficiently. They set up a mobile brief station in my hangar, ran cables, unloaded encrypted devices, and never said a word about the neighborhood beyond. Stay out of the way. Karen emerged from her house 5 minutes later with a neck brace and a camcorder, filming everything like she was preparing for some courtroom documentary. She shouted at the men in uniform, claiming they were trespassing on private HOA space. One of them turned to her and simply said, "Ma'am, this isn't your jurisdiction." Then the unthinkable happened. Karen stepped into the middle of the runway, holding up both hands, blocking a cargo truck attempting to move a secure container to the hangar. She shouted something about civilian safety and refused to move. And that's when the lead agent, someone I hadn't even met, stepped forward, showed her a Department of Justice badge, and said, "Ma'am, step aside or you'll be detained for obstruction of national security protocol." Karen froze. For once, words failed her. She backed away slowly, dropped her camcorder, and watched in complete silence as the operation resumed around her. That night, she didn't make a single post. No videos. No HOA alerts. Nothing. The suit she filed went quiet. Her lawyers stopped answering emails. And according to Dennis, she missed the next board meeting entirely. What she didn't know yet, what no one but a few of us did, was that the military had already filed a formal complaint with the state regarding her interference. Not just to stop her, but to make an example. Because there's a difference between nuisance and sabotage. And Karen had just crossed the line. In the days that followed the security briefing and Karen's runway stunt, a thick, uncomfortable quiet blanketed the entire neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from resolution, It was the eerie pause before fallout. People no longer waved as they passed her house. The once curious neighbors who had peeked out to see the cargo planes were now actively avoiding eye contact with her. Even her most devoted allies from the HOA had started pulling away, realizing that whatever crusade she'd been on had gone from laughable to dangerous. And as for Karen, she no longer stomped around the cul-de-sac with her clipboard or barked orders at teenagers about hedge height. Her bright SUV was parked in the garage, curtains were drawn tight, and the woman who once boasted about bringing order to chaos had vanished like fog under floodlights. Word eventually leaked, as it always does in neighborhoods like ours, that Karen had received more than just a warning. A formal letter had arrived, this one bearing the seal of the Department of Justice. It cited multiple violations including obstruction of federal operations, unlawful interference with contracted logistical assets, and a handful of state-level civil breaches related to misuse of HOA authority. The letter wasn't public, but one of the board members accidentally let it slip during a side conversation at the community garden. That piece of news moved faster than wildfire in dry brush. Overnight, Karen's reputation wasn't just damaged, it was obliterated. By the end of the week, the HOA held a closed-door emergency meeting, this time without her. Dennis, who had quietly risen as a calm and rational alternative to her theatrical leadership, chaired the session. It didn't take long for them to reach a decision. A community vote was scheduled for the following weekend to formally remove Karen from her position. Flyers were distributed, though this time with real HOA letterhead and no dramatic font. The flyer listed Karen's actions in a neutral but firm tone, citing her overreach, unauthorized spending, and repeated violation of state and federal boundaries. Residents were encouraged to vote with the integrity of the neighborhood in mind. That weekend, the turnout was massive. Families who rarely participated in HOA matters arrived early with folded ballots. Elderly residents who'd been silent during Karen's reign now walked confidently into the community center, casting their votes without hesitation. Even the teenagers she'd once targeted for excessive backyard noise high-fived each other as their parents scribbled names. When the votes were counted, the result was as decisive as it was humiliating. 92% voted to remove her permanently. Not suspend, not reprimand, permanently. Just like that, her reign was over. But it wasn't just her title that she lost. With her HOA presidency gone, the financial audit she had stalled was resumed. And that audit uncovered something even worse than her behavior on the runway. Karen had used HOA funds to pay her lawyer, purchased surveillance gear she installed around her property, and even funneled small amounts to what she labeled community enhancement services that turned out to be for landscaping on her private lawn. That revelation triggered legal action, not from the military this time, but from the HOA itself. A lawsuit was filed demanding restitution and civil penalties. Ironically, the same system she weaponized was now turning its full weight against her. I hadn't intended to attend the next HOA meeting, but Dennis personally invited me. Said it was the least they could do. When I showed up, I didn't wear a flight jacket or anything flashy, just jeans and a polo. But when I stepped into that room, people clapped. Not loud, not like some hero returning from war, but with quiet respect. It wasn't about drama or spectacle anymore. It was acknowledgement. I'd stood my ground, not just for myself, but for the integrity of something bigger. Dennis opened the meeting with a speech that surprised even me. He spoke about responsibility, about understanding the difference between authority and abuse, and about what it meant to live in a community, not control one. He pointed toward the runway once and said, "That strip of concrete isn't just part of Mark's property. It's part of this town's story now." A reminder that even in a quiet neighborhood, important things happen. And sometimes, those things need to be protected. Then he handed me a small plaque. It read, "In recognition of service to the community, Mark Callahan." I didn't need a medal. But holding that plaque, I felt something shift. A long, silent burden I hadn't realized I was carrying finally lifted. Karen, of course, didn't show. Her house remained quiet, her social media inactive. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn 2 weeks later. No grand announcement, no dramatic exit. Just a silent surrender. The house was listed discreetly, but the gossip traveled quickly. Rumor was she planned to move out of state to start fresh. I couldn't blame her. After everything, there was no coming back. She had gone to war with the wrong person. Not because I had more power, but because I had more patience, and more allies, and more truth. A few weeks later, another aircraft landed on the Strip. This time, a low-profile delivery for a nearby VA hospital. It was quiet, efficient, and exactly what the airfield was meant for. As the last of the cargo was wheeled away, one of the visiting officers nodded at me and said, "Cleanest field we've seen all month. Must be nice to have good neighbors." I smiled and told him, "It is now." And it really was. Dennis came by that evening with a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. We sat near the edge of the runway, watching the last light fade from the sky. He asked me what I planned to do now that the runway was safe again. I told him I'd keep doing what I always had, helping quietly, staying out of the way until I was needed. He laughed and said, "Well, let's hope you don't get needed too often." We clinked glasses. The bourbon was strong, but it went down smooth. As we sat there, I looked back toward the hangar, the same place I'd stood when the first sonic boom rattled the neighborhood and kicked off this madness. That moment had felt like an earthquake. Now, all that remained was stillness. The land was quiet, but not empty. It was full of stories, of lessons, of proof that even in a war of pettiness and power-tripping presidents, truth and resolve could still win. Karen was gone. The cones were gone. The signs were down. And the runway, long ignored, now stood not as a battleground, but a monument. To reason. To resilience. And to the power of staying grounded when everyone else is trying to fly off the rails. The war was over. The planes were landing again. And the skies above my home were finally clear.